Steven, welcome, and I'm super excited to be hosting a conversation with you again. They are so super inspiring, and for everybody who would like to know a little bit more about you, would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Of course. First of all, thanks for having me. It's always nice to talking with you, Adam. And yeah, my name is Steven Rottmann. I'm Senior Vice President at ProSieben. And we are experimenting with how we can organize our organizational structure, but also how we, can switch into a different work mode and how we can make experimentation key to our success.
And this is actually a great topic, so let me just ask you the question straight away. How to start, how to kick off?
So maybe let's start with the bigger picture, right? Normally, when organizations try to change or to transform, they have a clear plan, they know exactly what they want to do, and they want to follow it up. However, as we all know, a plan only survives as long as he meets the reality, right? And this is the reason why we actually did experiments. And we used experiments in two kinds of ways. So basically what we said is that an experimentation is kind of a trial where you try out something, and it is also okay to fail, right? And maybe you don't have the concrete end in mind. Of course, you have an orientation where you want to go to, right? But you might not know exactly what it looks like. And this is actually what we used in my organization to basically start change and transformation and to make actually the change kind of a static thing, right? So when using experiments in my organization, it's clear that we are trying out something, that it's okay to fail, and that we can go as small steps as needed, depending on how we define the experiment.
This is like how you set the culture, enabling everybody to feel comfortable to start experimenting without a clear finish, but with a clear, intuitive, or backed up by data insights, what can be better. And once I remember during our conversation, I was super inspired when you told me about tensions. Can you tell us a little bit what tensions are and how to capture them?
Yeah, sure, of course. So basically, if you use the word tensions, I would also describe it as kind of a need, right? So there is something that creates either pressure, tension, or some kind of need to change, for example, or to further develop. And if you have something like that, it will definitely help to start change, right? Because you need to explain why do we need to change? Why do we need to do something different? And why do we want to go where we want to go, right? And this is basically for myself, actually, all packed within the word of tension. So what is it? What is the why we need to change?
So how do you start working with tension? So like, how do you announce to the team to capture tensions and then share the tensions? What does this process look like?
Yeah, so basically what I did when we decided that we want to do those experiments, right, I was communicating very, very transparently, right? I told the guys what my opinions are, what my views are, but I also invited them, and this is maybe the more important part, to share their thoughts and their concerns, right, and their tensions and needs and stuff like that. Because, well, if you make it a common topic, it's a lot easier to handle it. On the one hand, because everybody can contribute, and on the other hand, of course, because everybody, feels that they can change something, that they can drive topics, and this really, really helps.
All right, so let's say we have a leader and they want to start doing it tomorrow. What would be the first step that they could take in order to involve team to capture all these needs/tensions?
So basically, from my perspective, it is very important that as a leader, you have at least some kind of idea where it might go to. You shouldn't have a final and clearly defined picture, right, that you want to paint, because then you are too strict and too, focused on what you are thinking, but have a vague idea at least, right? Then share this with the team. Or with a part of the team, it depends on the approach that you want to take, right? And then give the chance that everybody can, share their thoughts. So what we did, for example, I basically set some kind of goals before we started experimenting. So I said, roughly, where do we want to end up, right? Roughly, not a clear picture, but roughly. And then we said, let's write some kind of a target story, right? And actually, there were selected team members who were involved in this experiment, and those were the guys who started to write a target picture. Then they took the target picture, discussed it with the departments and with the teams, and sooner or later we got some kind of bottom-up and top-down mix of where do we want to belong. And having those target pictures was actually perfect, because we were aligned on where do we see each other. We also knew where might be differences, and we started together to think about the future and where do we want to end up, right? So basically, I just gave the initial spark, right? And then basically the flames developed out of that.
And technically, how often do you need to drive communication / workshop with a group of people if you want to engage them into change?
Yeah, so what I would say is communication needs to be static. It needs to be every day, basically, right? And of course, there are maybe some topics where you need a special workshop or a special session because you want to communicate in detail. However, it's very, very, very important to really communicate very frequently, right? So that everybody has the chance to hear what is happening, that everybody can be part of the journey, right? So this is very, very important. Apart from that, of course, it always makes sense to have some touch points, right? So for example, what we did in the beginning, when we were starting to develop the experiments and set up the experiments, we had regular meetings, right? We met basically every week or every second week. And after a while, after we developed some kind of basic foundation, right, we said, okay, now we don't need those regular meetings anymore. We only need it in certain situations. And we set them up not on a regular basis, but then when we need them. Right? So this is basically kind of a development that you are going through, similar to how you accompany a change cycle.
It was like in the beginning. There were more meetings and more workshops around the topic, and like over the time, the team already got certain behaviors into the skin, yes. So they adopted certain behaviors to their culture, and then
absolutely
you wouldn't need the same amount of meetings here, right?
And it grows into operations mode. You know, in the beginning, everything is new and you need to adapt to a new situation. But after a while, when you are living it, it gets into operations and you just do it daily.
Did you encounter any resistance, anybody on the way who would question whether these approaches might be effective and result in what you are aiming as an organization?
Yeah, definitely. I assume, you know, like humans are built, there will always be some people who question whether is this the right way. And that's totally fine, because you also need those critical voices, because it makes you think about, is this what we are doing and planning all right or not? But then again, I bring in the experimentation, right? And we say, let's try it. If it's safe enough to try and good enough for now, let's try it. Then we see whether it really works or not. And if we can roll back easily, why should it hurt somebody, right? And this is basically something that is very, very helpful and very powerful, because it gives people the chance to make new experiences. And from my perspective, experiences are the things that really change your mindset and that really bring you along the way. And that's amazing, right? And sometimes it might be that you experience something and you say, well, that was maybe not the best try, but oftentimes you can capture also these colleagues who are maybe a little bit more careful, let's say it like that, and can take them along the way with you, because they have certain touch points and they can try it out. And if they don't like it, well, if the entire organization doesn't like it, you roll back.
And I remember that you also shared one very interesting story with me, like a bold move.
Yeah.
When you decided to eliminate department leads or use the moment when department leads left and not really rehiring for these roles. Can you tell us more about
Yes.
this process and this experiment?
Of course. So basically, this was also, let's say, at least one part of the tension or of the need that was created, right? Because we were going through a transformation and a restructuring, and suddenly there were less leaders available for my division, right? And so basically there would have been, of course, the chance to just rehire and have the same structure. However, knowing that we live in a very dynamic environment, I said, there needs to be something else, right? Because we need to react really fast. And sometimes leaders can make a process a little bit slower than it needs to be, right? They maybe get bottlenecked because they have a lot of stuff on their plate, or maybe there are some interests that they are following, right? Since they are also people, or sometimes they might not be aligned with other colleagues or something like that. And so basically we said, what could we set up our organization and how can we work differently without having all those leaders and leadership positions within the organization? And this is actually when we started to experiment and build up the experiment, right? So we were sitting together with representatives from each department and team. Some colleagues that supported us from outside, right, whom had experience with some kind of agile working mode in other companies as well. And so we developed the experiment, which we call leadership roles, right? And basically what we did is that we, instead of having one central leadership position, we split up the leadership responsibility into 5 different roles. And these are the roles that we are working in now. The roles are speaker. It's basically somebody who's coping with communication inside and outside of the team. Then there's the navigator, who is basically somebody who is developing strategy, but also helping to implement it, who is coping with OKRs and goals, and who is actually also having some kind of overview about high-level team capacity. So can we manage to do another project or maybe not, right? Apart from that, we say that strong teams have a good culture, and that we needed a culture and team developer role, who is also coping with team atmosphere and stuff. Of course, there's some kind of subject matter topic, right? So we have a subject matter expert. And last but not least, we have the bureaucratic administrator, who is basically coping with the disciplinary requirements, which are mostly bound either by systems or by organizational requirements, right? Because the organization says a leader has to do this and that, and other people cannot do that, right? This is basically the 5 roles that we are running in. And now comes the best part. Those roles, they are not handed top down. They are rather elected bottom up within the team. And that's amazing. And we are very flexible with this model because basically each and every leader who originally had all the 5 roles inside his responsibility can decide which role do I want to offer for the team to take, right? And which role maybe do I want to keep for myself in a first step, because maybe I don't feel that comfortable, or maybe I don't see somebody who could actually do the role very, very good, right? But nevertheless, we have the flexibility to either build the hierarchical structure that most companies have, or we can be very, very flexible and distribute leadership. And that's amazing because we created so much momentum out of that, so much motivation, and also teams of teams. And that's amazing to see.
Amazing, amazing to hear about it. And what surprised you the most?
Yeah, well, actually, I was surprised how quickly and how fast we developed as an organization, right? Normally, you have a number in mind that 70% of transformations fail. I would actually call this transformation a success. And that is amazing. That was really surprising because, you know, I had the feeling doing this with the entire organization might be a little bit tricky. How do I keep everybody on board? What if people don't want to work like that? But basically, this was never a big issue, right? Because people who wanted to contribute could do that. People who said, well, it's not the way what I want to do, they can focus on their subject matters, right? And that's perfect. So that was really, really surprising for me that it went that smoothly.
There are always people who complain, so I was wondering who was complaining.
You know, I think that I wouldn't call it complaining, right? I would rather call it offering some thoughts and some experiences that people did, because everybody has some kind of perception of the environment, right? And if somebody says, well, there might be a complaint, it's basically an offer how you can improve. So that's the way I see it, at least, right? So normally what we do is trying to hear the voices. And of course, sometimes you can really listen to them and maybe change something, and sometimes you can't, right? But seeing the chance within those complaints is actually quite powerful. And I think that this was also one of the parts how it was possible for us to develop all the experiments that we are doing, and basically to develop the organization and the way of working that we are now using.
All right, so let's get back for a second to experiments and measuring their effectiveness. How did you approach it? Like
so basically, for me, it's very important to see what really does change, right? So if we are starting something, then we have at least the big picture in our mind, what we want to achieve, right? And so we said, basically for us, it is very important to also get at least some kind of measure or some kind of data, how we are doing, right? Are we going into the right direction, or is it going maybe a different direction that we didn't assume? And so we started at the beginning to get some kind of baseline on the goals that we were following, right? So what we said on the one hand was that we want to be faster in decision making. So at the beginning, we measured how fast are we, right? So that we have a baseline. We also said, let's measure in which way it is possible to take over leadership without having a disciplinary leadership role. This was also something included there. We also measured how flexible are we, right? And we measured what is the motivational level of our employees at the moment. So these are only 4 examples. I think there were quite some more. And so we created the baseline at the beginning. And every month we did the same survey to get a feeling, how are we developing, right? So it didn't matter, do we reach KPI A, B, or C at the exact level? It was rather about what is the tendency that we are developing in, right? And this was amazing because we improved in every of those categories. And this is actually what we wanted to achieve, and we improved significantly. And that's amazing.
How can you approach measuring speed of decision making? Like how to build the baseline for it?
It depends, right? In some parts it's easy. Sometimes you might have kind of a Jira board where you have tracking times and stuff like that. And in others, you might just have a feeling of how fast are we, right? Inside the own organization, but also outside the organization. So how are you perceived? Are you getting better or not? Right? And this is basically kind of a blended rate. So in some parts we had some measurements on real timings, and in some parts we were just going through the survey and getting a feeling of, did we get faster?
Did you have any highs or lows in the process, or was it like a stagnant growth of all the metrics that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think like this is basically as almost every change or transformation, right? So when we did actually the first announcement that we are going to do an experiment, I would rather say that it was kind of an excitement, right? Because everybody was like, oh, what is going to happen? What will it be like, right? Then we had actually an increase, I would say, in terms of motivation and excitedness when we started to develop our first experiment, right? When we communicated our leadership roles, which was the first experiment, I think suddenly there was kind of a drop in excitedness because everybody was like, okay, what do we do now? Well, how will that really change our daily doing, right? Because it was a big change. And so it went down maybe a little bit, right? But seeing our measurements, we were able to track that this really got up again in excitedness because people felt, wow, we can change something. We have responsibility. We can take over responsibility, which was very cool. But later on, there was also a little bit of dip, right? Because, you know, we defined the roles and the responsibilities and what are the do's and what are the don'ts. However, it still needs some time to get used to it, and sometimes there are challenges that you can't foresee, so you need to change them along the time. And this, of course, gets a little bit of a dip in excitedness. However, what I can tell you, and there's also another measurement, right? When we were talking about the current setup and how we are working, I asked basically, do you guys rather want to work in this setup? And if so, how many? Or would you rather work in the hierarchical setup that you know from before? And 87% of the people in my organization said they would love to work in this setup that we created newly. And this is amazing.
And speaking about it, it sounds all great, the shared leadership, building engagement and motivation over time. I just love it. So let me ask you, what boundaries of shared leadership, or maybe not boundaries, but risks, or what do you need to look at when you think about shared leadership?
Yeah, so basically, if you delegate responsibility and not just tasks, it's very, very important that you have kind of a clear frame in which a team, a department, an organization is allowed to move in, right? So what we did in parallel to all the experiments that we developed and set up is that we defined what are our strategic guidelines coming from a very broad perspective, right? To create the frame, and then also to create and develop our strategy, right? So where are we in the entire business? What is the strategy that we follow, and what are our strategic goals that we want to achieve, right? And we even broke them down coming from the big strategy to the OKRs, basically to the daily doing, what the teams are doing and what each and every person is doing. And this is very, very important and complementary to the experimentation, because that people can experiment and still go into the right direction, they of course need the frame in which they can move around, and also kind of an orientation, where do we want to go to? So this is an absolute prerequisite, right? Apart from that, you know, it's important also to mention maybe some challenges that we are facing. And what we are facing, especially the leadership roles that are still left in the organization, is not that we do not have to do a lot of tasks. No, we have a lot of tasks, of course, but it's rather about switching from maybe being in details to giving guidance, to giving context, and to communicating a lot, right? Really a lot, because basically you don't just have 3 or 5 direct reports anymore, who are your direct leaders, right? But rather the entire organization somehow is connected to you. So you can, and it's on the one hand a chance, communicate with a lot of people and install the strategy, the vision, the culture that you want to have. But on the other hand, you also have to talk to a lot of people, right? Which makes communication absolute key.
Super. Engage, communicate, drive change, drive initiatives, measure their effectiveness over time. Awesome. Steven, what's next?
What's next is basically, well, that we are looking to establish the working mode that we are currently doing as a, let's say, standard working mode, right? And for my organization, we are running in this setup for around about 1.5 years now, which is very cool. And now we need to check with the Workers' Council, how can we set this up so that it can be a standard as well. Maybe besides other organizational structures and forms, but how can we make this a standard, right? Because we feel that we improved, that we can drive change, that we can actually offer something where we can handle the dynamic environment that we are living in.
So this is a great topic for the next conversation that we can have in a year or maybe a few months. Let's see how it develops. Steven, thank you so much. Excellent conversation. I learned a lot from you. I hope everybody who've watched this video also learned a lot.
Perfect.
Super.
Thank you, Adam, for having me.
Steven, thank you so much.